They say not all battles are fought on the front lines. Some are carried silently in the hearts of those who return home. A man can give everything for his country and still walk unnoticed through the world, carrying memories heavier than metals. This is the story of Frank Mercer, an old soldier who asked for nothing, yet carried a courage that time almost erased. Until one day in the quiet hall of a museum, his past rose up to meet him again. If you believe some stories are too important to be forgotten, stay with me. And don't forget to follow, like, and leave a comment so these voices can keep living on. The glass doors of the Veterans Heritage Museum whispered shut behind him, sealing out the November wind. Frank Mercer paused just inside the lobby, cane in hand, shoulders square despite the weight of 76 years. His brown field jacket, frayed at the cuffs and faded across the shoulders, carried a patch nearly worn through, the screaming eagle of the 101st Airborne. Few noticed it anymore. Fewer still understood what it meant. He moved at his own pace, neither hurried nor hesitant, nodding politely at the young man behind the desk. The clerk, scarcely older than 20, tapped at his tablet but without much interest. "Excuse me, sir," he called after Frank. "We actually require timed entry tickets now. Do you have one?" Frank turned, steady, his voice calm. "No, I've been coming here every Veterans Week since the doors opened. Just wanted to sit a while quietly." The clerk hesitated. His co-worker leaned close and whispered something too low to hear, but her expression said enough. "He's just loitering again." The words weren't spoken aloud, yet Frank felt their weight all the same. He had carried heavier burdens, but even so, dismissal cut deeper than most people guessed. He pressed on down the hallway, cane tapping lightly with each step, until he reached the far end where the memorial wall stretched from floor to ceiling. Black glass reflected his face back at him, softened by thousands of etched names. He lowered himself carefully onto the wooden bench, both hands resting atop the curved head of his cane. He didn't pull out a phone or raise a camera. He only looked. Each name shimmered beneath the overhead lights like fragments of memory, and Frank let silence wash through him. From the desk, the clerk frowned and whispered into his radio. Minutes later, a young security guard appeared, broad-shouldered and brimming with the certainty of new authority. His steps were firm, almost eager, as though each one proved his usefulness. "Sir," he said, voice clipped, "I'm going to need you to leave the museum." Frank blinked slowly up at him. "Why?" "You've been reported for loitering. We've had complaints." Frank's knees crackled as he stood. He didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice. He simply nodded as though this too was one more order to follow, and adjusted the sleeve of his jacket. The faded eagle patch had caught the light, threads nearly broken, but still holding. The guard reached out, too firm, to guide him toward the exit. Frank accepted the grip without protest. His strength these days was measured in restraint, not resistance. But just before his next step, a sharp voice cut through the hush of the hall. "Hold it." The command froze the guard in place. Heads turned toward the entryway, where a man in full dress uniform stood tall, silver eagles gleaming on his collar. Ribbons across his chest like a mosaic of memory. A general. His eyes locked in onto Frank's patch, and the air shifted. For a heartbeat, no one moved. The general's voice carried not as a question, but as a memory resurfaced. "Where did you get that?" The guard's grip loosened. The clerk at the desk swallowed hard. Frank turned, slow and steady, meeting the general's gaze. He didn't answer at once. The years had taught him patience. Sometimes silence spoke loudest. Most days, Frank Mercer drifted unnoticed through town. He was not frail, not yet, but life had folded into routine. Black coffee from a dented kettle, a walk down Oak Street to the park bench beneath the elm, breakfast at the corner diner where Sandy brought scrambled eggs without salt. He carried no medals, told no stories unless asked, and few ever asked. To them, he was just another old man with a cane and a jacket too warm for fall. But in this room, under the weight of the general's gaze, the patch on his shoulder was no longer invisible. "You're Frank Mercer, aren't you?" the general said, stepping forward, ignoring the staff as though they didn't exist. Frank studied him carefully. The voice rang with familiarity, but the veil of years blurred memory. "I am," he said, cautious. "And you are." The general's lips curved. somewhere between a smile and a salute. Thomas Garrison. My father was Captain Tom Garrison. The name struck like a flare in the dark. Frank's eyes flickered, recognition surfacing. He remembered a boy in a family photo, bright-eyed, cradled in the arms of a man Frank once carried half a mile through fire and falling debris. His voice, quieter now, carried both disbelief and memory. "You're his son." The general nodded firmly. "My father used to tell a story about a mechanic with a busted knee who carried him out when the tunnel collapsed. He said he owed his life to a man who didn't wait for orders, just got it done." Frank exhaled a soft chuckle, almost embarrassed. "He always did exaggerate." "No," the general replied, steel in his tone. "He didn't." The lobby had fallen utterly still. Even the front desk clerk leaned forward, pale and silent. The young guard shifted, suddenly aware of the hand he had laid on a man whose service patch predated his own birth. "You put your hands on someone who stood long before you ever did," the general said sharply, turning to the guard. "Think carefully about how you treat those who came before you." The guard's face drained of color. He muttered, "I'm sorry, sir," though it wasn't clear to whom the apology belonged. Frank waved it away gently. "Let the boy be. He didn't know." "That's the problem," the general said, eyes never leaving him. "Too many don't." He extended a hand, inviting without insistence. "Would you come with me? There's something I'd like to show you." Frank hesitated, then gave a single nod. Together they walked side by side down the Hall of Honor. No one stopped them. No one dared. The general paused at the bench where Frank had tried to sit earlier and gestured to the wall of names. "You belong here," he said softly, "more than any plaque we've ever printed." Frank didn't answer, but for the first time all day, a faint smile touched his face. Not for recognition, not for apology, but for the simple weight of being seen again. Morning broke with the smell of strong black coffee rising from the dented kettle Frank Mercer had used for decades. He leaned against the counter, steadying himself with one hand as the other wrapped around the mug, steam fogging the kitchen window. His apartment was quiet, walls bare except for a shelf of worn books and an old radio that hadn't found a clear station in years. In the closet rested a box he rarely touched, medals, photographs, and a letter he had never mailed. The Bronze Star lay among them, still shining beneath the dust, but to Frank it was only a reminder of a day that left more ghosts than glory. That morning, as he sipped his coffee, he thought of Tom Garrison. In a faded photo, they stood together on a jungle trail, arms slung over shoulders, shirts unbuttoned, grinning like boys too stubborn to be afraid. War hardened them, but in that moment captured forever. They had been young, reckless, alive. Tom hadn't made it back. Frank had. The guilt of survival, the questions without answers, followed him long after the uniform came off. At the diner, Sandy slid a plate in front of him. Scrambled eggs, rye toast, no salt. She never called him sir, only Mr. Mercer. And in that simple courtesy, Frank found a comfort most people overlooked. Recognition didn't always need ceremony. Sometimes it was enough to be remembered as a man, not a relic. But the museum was different. The museum had tried to erase him. When the general had spoken his name the day before, Frank had felt time collapse in on itself. The weight of years vanished in the recognition of a single voice. He hadn't realized how much he had needed, someone to remember. Later that afternoon, the general's words echoed back to him. "My father used to tell a story about a mechanic with a busted knee who carried him out." Frank stirred his coffee absent-mindedly, replaying that memory with sharper clarity. The tunnel had been half gone, beams collapsing, dirt choking the air. Tom had been pinned, his leg crushed beneath twisted metal. Orders weren't coming. Reinforcements were miles away. Frank hadn't thought, hadn't waited. He braced the beam with his shoulder, ignoring the fire that tore through his knee, and dragged Tom out yard by yard. His lungs burned, his muscles screamed, but he kept moving until daylight split the smoke. Tom had lived. Barely. Frank never told anyone what it cost. Now, standing in that museum hall decades later, to hear a general repeat the story from his father's lips, it struck something deep. He realized Tom had carried his gratitude home, had told his family, had passed down Frank's name like an inheritance. When Frank returned home that evening, his steps were the same. cane tapping the cracked sidewalks. But something around him felt lighter. At the diner, Sandy waved before he reached the door. "Your usual tomorrow, Mr. Mercer?" she called. For the first time in a long while, he looked forward to it. That night, there was a knock at his door, two soft taps. Frank opened it to find a young man in a navy sweatshirt clutching a folded newspaper clipping. His voice was cautious but curious. "Are you the same Frank Mercer in this article?" Frank frowned. "What article?" The young man handed it over. It was a photo from 1970. Dust-smeared faces, a wrecked transport in the background. Frank at the center, tighter, younger and unbroken. The headline read, "Local mechanic saves 6 in tunnel collapse. Bronze Star awarded." "My grandfather kept this," the man explained. "He said you once rebuilt an engine under fire. Got them all home." "That was your squad, wasn't it?" Frank traced the image with a finger. The memory came back in fragments. Metal groaning, the wrench slipping, voices shouting for him to hurry. He swallowed hard. "I suppose it was," he said quietly. The young man didn't linger. He simply nodded, said, "Thank you, sir," and left. Frank stood at the door for a long while after it closed, the clipping trembling faintly in his hand. He had been forgotten by so many, yet suddenly pieces of his past were being handed back to him. The next morning, as the sun lit the museum steps, a small handwritten sign appeared outside. The paper was plain, taped to the door without ceremony, but its words carried weight. "To Sergeant Mercer, we apologize. Your seat is reserved." When Frank returned later that week, the bench in front of the memorial wall bore a folded card, left beneath the morning light. On the cover, 3 simple words, "Welcome back." Inside, handwritten with careful strokes, were only 2 more, "We remember." He lowered himself onto the bench slowly, cane resting beside him. For years he had come here unnoticed, dismissed, invisible. But now, in that quiet hall, the seat felt different. Not because of apology, but because the silence around him had shifted. People had begun to look again, to see. Frank didn't smile easily, but as he rested there in front of the black glass etched with names, a small curve touched his lips. For the first time in many years, he felt not only present, but recognized. The world had tried to make him invisible. Yet memory, stubborn and strong, had pulled him back into sight. And in that moment, Frank Mercer understood. His story wasn't finished. Not yet. The letter arrived in a thick cream-colored envelope, the kind reserved for wedding invitations or official notices. Frank sat at his kitchen table, glasses perched low on his nose, as he unfolded the page inside. The handwriting was neat, deliberate, almost formal. "Mr. Mercer, we failed to recognize not just your service, but your presence. Our staff acted without knowledge and without respect. That is our burden to fix. You are welcome here anytime. No ticket required. We'd like to host a small gathering in your honor. If not for ceremony, then simply to say we remember. With respect, Mabel Lam, Director, Veterans Heritage Museum." Frank read it twice, then folded it carefully and slid it into the top drawer of his desk. He didn't smile, didn't sigh, only nodded once, as though someone had finally spoken a language he had waited years to hear. That Friday, the general returned, not in full dress, but in a pressed jacket, posture still commanding even without the weight of medals. He joined Frank at the corner diner, where Sandy greeted them both with coffee and pie. They talked not like strangers and not quite like old friends, but like men bound by the invisible thread of history. "I looked up a name," the general said, stirring his cup. "Corporal Ellis. My father wrote about him in one of his journals. He said he owed his life to a mechanic who didn't wait for orders." Frank leaned back, eyes narrowing slightly at the memory. "Ellis was brave. That tunnel wouldn't have held if he hadn't propped the beam while I worked. I was just the wrench guy." The general shook his head. "That wrench guy kept half a squad alive with nothing but a bent axle and grit. My father never forgot it. Neither should we." Frank didn't answer. He didn't need to. Not long after, a small wooden plaque appeared beneath the museum bench where Frank had once been told to leave. The words were carved, simple and clear. "Reserved, Franklin Mercer, 101st Airborne. Still standing. Visitors noticed. Some paused to read. A few older veterans removed their caps and saluted the space even when Frank wasn't there. For the first time, the bench felt less like a seat and more like a marker, quiet recognition set into wood. One afternoon, the young security guard who had once gripped Frank's elbow returned. No bravado this time, only humility. He approached slowly, cap in hand. His voice was low, almost breaking. "I was wrong, sir. I read about you. I didn't see it then." Frank studied him for a moment, then nodded gently. "I didn't expect you to. Just try to see the next one." The guard swallowed hard, nodded back, and walked away. Justice didn't roar. It simply landed where it was owed. What began as a quiet idea, a small gathering arranged by the museum director, grew into something larger. Word traveled through town not with announcements but with whispers, passed from neighbor to neighbor, diner booth to diner booth, until the plan could no longer stay small. By Sunday morning, rows of folding chairs covered the lawn outside the museum. No banners hung, no microphones stood, only a single flag waving against the autumn breeze. Frank didn't want to sit in the front row, but the general insisted. "You earned that chair before half of us were born," he said. "You're not hiding in the back today." Frank wore his brown jacket again, but this time the airborne patch had been restitched, cleaned, upright. He sat quietly, shoulders firm, cane across his knees, while the crowd settled. Faces from his past appeared. Sandy from the diner brought a still warm apple pie wrapped in string. A boy from the high school newspaper adjusted his camera, snapping photographs with deliberate care. Not for likes, but for memory. People who had once passed him on the street without a glance now stood with him. The general stepped forward, wind catching his voice as he faced the small crowd. He didn't look at notes. He didn't need to. "Some men leave footprints you don't see until they're nearly gone," he began. "They don't ask for recognition. They don't expect applause. They just show up over and over." He turned toward Frank, voice steady. "When others ran, you stayed. When others waited, you moved. When this town forgot, you returned anyway." He reached into his coat and pulled out a small, dark blue box. Inside lay a service medallion engraved with a single phrase, "For quiet valor that still speaks." Frank rose slowly, knees stiff, and accepted it with both hands. For a long moment, silence hung heavy across the crowd. Then one by one, people stood, not to clap, not to cheer, but simply to rise with him. No one filled the air with noise. Respect doesn't always need volume. It only needs to be seen. That evening, the bench at the museum no longer stood empty. Some sat with notebooks, some left flowers, some simply paused in quiet thought. The space had transformed, not by speeches or announcements, but by presence. Frank returned home to his small apartment, metal resting on the shelf beside an old photo of three young men grinning through jungle heat. He placed a sticky note on the back of the frame. The words were plain: "Still here, still grateful." The town had remembered. And for the first time in years, Frank felt he had been restored to his rightful place, not in the past, but in the present, where memory and recognition finally walk side by side. The bench at the Veterans Heritage Museum became more than a seat. It grew into a quiet shrine, a place where strangers lingered and veterans paused to salute. Some mornings, a high school student sat with a notebook, scribbling thoughts for a history essay. Other times, flowers appeared, white lilies in a mason jar, left without name or card. The plaque beneath the bench read clearly, "Reserved, Franklin Mercer, 101st Airborne," still standing. At the diner, the changes were subtle but unmistakable. Sandy no longer wrote his order on her pad. She simply poured black coffee, set scrambled eggs and rye toast before him, and gave a nod. When he reached for his wallet, she waved him off. "You were always good to us," she said softly one morning. "We just forgot to say it." Frank looked at her, eyes lined by years, and answered with the weight of simplicity. "That's all right, you're saying it now." Weeks passed and an invitation arrived from the local high school. The principal wrote by hand, the ink uneven but sincere. "We would be honored if you could speak at our Veterans Day assembly. The students want to hear from someone real." Beneath the signature were 20 more names, scrawled by students who had added their voices. "We don't want a hero. We want to hear from someone real." At first, Frank declined. Speeches had never been his way, but those words stayed with him. Someone real. So on that Friday morning, he stood behind a wooden podium in the gymnasium, facing 300 students and staff. No slideshow glowed behind him. No booming microphone carried his words. It was only him, a folded piece of paper he never read from, and the silence of those who waited. "I've been called a few things," he began, voice steady though low. "Mechanic, sergeant, husband, nuisance." He let the last word hang raw and unflinching. But names don't matter as much as showing up. I just kept showing up, even when no one noticed. The gym remained still. Rows of students leaned forward. Some blinked harder than they expected. Frank's eyes moved across them slowly, grounding his words not in grandeur, but in truth. "I don't need applause," Denise said. "I never did. I just wanted to know the things I gave were worth something. And if someone in your life shows up for you quietly, daily, without needing thanks, notice them. That's service too." When he finished, no one stood. No clapping erupted too soon. The silence itself carried weight, and in that stillness, Frank found the kind of recognition he had always valued most. As autumn gave way to winter, the porch light outside Frank's apartment stopped burning out. He replaced the bulb himself, muttering about cheap wiring and cold fingers. But the glow held steady every night after. Not because he was waiting for visitors, but because people had begun to come by on their own. Sandy brought a pie once a week, wrapped in tin and tied with string. The museum director stopped in occasionally, bringing along students eager to hear what jungle humidity felt like, or how an engine could be rebuilt under fire. Even the young security guard returned, not alone but with his father, a retired Air Force medic. They shook Frank's hand together in a silence that spoke louder than rehearsed words. On the shelf above his radio, the medallion from the general rested beside the photo of 3 soldiers on a jungle trail. A sticky note clung to the back of the frame. Still here, still grateful. Snow fell softly across Oak Street the evening Frank sat on his porch, collar turned up, a warm mug in his hands. The porch light glowed above him like a quiet flag. A boy on a bicycle skidded to a stop across the street, tires squealing against the thin dusting of ice. He raised a hand. "Hi, Mr. Frank. My teacher read your story in class." Frank lifted his mug slightly in greeting. "Is that so?" The boy nodded, breath puffing in the cold. "She said you weren't loud like the other veterans, but that you still mattered." Frank smiled, small but certain. "She's a smart one." The boy grinned, then pedaled off, disappearing around the corner. Frank leaned back in his chair, wood creaking beneath him, but it held, just as he always had. For years he had been overlooked, mistaken for a nuisance, a shadow in a place built to remember. But now, as the light glowed steady above his porch and footsteps marked the snow outside his door, he no longer felt invisible. He was not a burden to move or a problem to solve. He was home. If you believe quiet dignity still deserves a place in this world, follow, like, and comment below to keep stories like Frank Mercer's alive.